In the year 1162, on the vast grasslands of Central Asia, beneath skies that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a child was born who would reshape the entire world. His name was Temujin, and he came into this world clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, an omen that the shamans declared meant he was destined for greatness, destined to conquer. The Mongolian steppe was a harsh and unforgiving land. Temperatures could plunge to -40 degrees in winter and soar unbearably hot in summer. The nomadic tribes who called this place home lived by an ancient code, moving with their herds across the endless sea of grass, following patterns their ancestors had traced for thousands of years. These were not soft people. From the moment they could walk, Mongolian children learned to ride horses. By the age of 3, they were strapped to the saddle. By 5, they could shoot a bow. The steppe-bred warriors, survivors, people who understood that in this brutal landscape, only the strong endured. Temujin's father, Yasujii, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan. He had kidnapped Temujin's mother, Holun, from another tribe in the traditional Mongol way of taking brides. It was a world of constant warfare, shifting alliances, and brutal competition for scarce resources. When Temujin was only 9 years old, his father was poisoned by the Tatars, a rival tribe who had invited Yasujii to share a meal. It was an act of treachery that would scar Temujin forever and plant the seeds of a vengeance that would one day consume entire nations. With Yasujii dead, the clan abandoned his family. In the harsh calculus of steppe survival, a widow and her young children were simply mouths to feed. Temujin, his mother, his brothers, and his half-brothers were left to die on the open grassland. They had nothing. No herds. No protection. No future. His mother, Holun, refused to surrender. She gathered wild onions, berries, and roots. She taught her children to fish in the rivers and hunt small animals. Through sheer force of will, she kept her family alive through winters that should have killed them all. These years of desperate poverty forged Temujin into something harder than iron. He learned that survival depended not on birthright or noble blood, but on cunning, strength, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Every day was a lesson in the brutal arithmetic of the steppe. The young Temujin also learned the price of betrayal. When his older half-brother, Bektur, began stealing food from the family and asserting dominance over them, Temujin and his brother Khazar killed him. It was a shocking act that revealed the cold ruthlessness already forming in Temujin's heart. When his mother confronted him, his only response was that Bektur had threatened the family's survival. His enemies soon captured him. The Tatyudi clan, who had abandoned his family, locked a wooden collar around Temujin's neck, the mark of a slave. He was paraded through their camps, humiliated, broken. But even in chains, Temujin was planning, watching, waiting for his moment. One night, during a feast when his guards were drunk on fermented mare's milk, Temujin struck his captor with the wooden collar and fled into the darkness. He hid in a river, breathing through a reed, while his enemies searched the banks with torches. A family from the tribe risked everything to hide him, recognizing something extraordinary in the young fugitive. When he finally returned to his family, Temujin was no longer a boy. The humiliation of slavery, the betrayal of his father's clan, the desperate years of poverty had transformed him. He had learned lessons that no comfortable upbringing could ever teach. He understood now that the world was divided into those who took and those who were taken from. He would never be a victim again. Despite the hardships, Temujin's father had arranged a marriage for him before his death. The girl was named Borte from the Ongjurat tribe. When Temujin came of age, he traveled to claim his bride. This marriage would prove to be one of the most important relationships of his life. Borte would become not just his wife, but his most trusted advisor. But tragedy struck again. The Merkits, a powerful tribe seeking revenge for Temujin's mother's kidnapping years earlier, raided Temujin's small camp and took Borte. For months she was held captive. The young man who had lost everything once before now faced losing the woman he loved. This time Temujin fought back. He called upon old alliances, including Togrul Khan of the Khwarezmians and his childhood blood brother Jamuka. Together, they assembled a force of 20,000 warriors. It was the first time Temujin commanded a real army, and he discovered something about himself. He was born to lead men in war. The attack on the Merkits was devastating. Temujin's forces swept through their camps like a wildfire. The battle cry that would one day echo across continents first rang out on that night. Temujin found Borte and rescued her, though she was pregnant, likely by a Merkit captor. The child Joki would always carry the shadow of uncertain parentage. Temujin accepted Joki as his son without question. To reject Borte for something that was not her fault would have been to punish the victim. This decision revealed another aspect of Temujin's character. He was ruthless with enemies, but fiercely loyal to those he loved. Borte would remain his chief wife, his partner, his confidant until his death. Word of the Merkit victory spread across the steppe. Warriors began to seek out the young chieftain who had avenged his family's honor. Temujin welcomed them, regardless of their tribal origins. This was revolutionary. Traditional Mongol society was built on blood ties and clan loyalty. Temujin offered something different. Loyalty to him would be rewarded. Betrayal would be punished. Tribe meant nothing. Service meant everything. For a time, Temujin and his blood brother Jamuka ruled together. They had sworn the Anda oath as boys, mixing their blood and pledging eternal brotherhood. But two alphas cannot lead one pack. Their visions for the Mongol people were fundamentally different. Jamuka believed in the old aristocratic order, where noble blood determined rank. Temujin believed in meritocracy, where skill and loyalty trumped birth. The split came suddenly. One morning, Jamuka made a cryptic statement about moving camp that Temujin's followers interpreted as a rejection. Through that day and night, warriors streamed from Jamuka's camp to Temujin's. The common people, the herders and hunters, chose the man who judged them by their abilities rather than their ancestry. In 1186, Temujin's followers held a Kurultai, a traditional gathering of chiefs. They proclaimed him Khan, king of their confederation. He was only in his mid-20s, but he had already survived more than most men experience in a lifetime. The boy who had eaten rats to survive was now a king. But he dreamed of something greater. The Mongolian steppe was still divided among dozens of warring tribes. The Tatars who had killed his father. The Techudi who had enslaved him. The Naimans to the west. The Merkits he had already humbled. Powerful kingdoms surrounded the steppe. The Jin dynasty of northern China. The western Xia. The Khwarezmian Empire. Each one saw the nomads as barbarians, nuisances to be managed, never as a real threat. Temujin began the long work of building his power. He reorganized his followers into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, breaking up tribal groupings and mixing men from different clans. Soldiers were promoted based on skill and loyalty, not bloodline. He created a personal guard, the Kashig, fiercely devoted warriors who served as both his protectors and his administrators. The wars of unification were brutal. At the Battle of Dalan Balshut, Jamuka inflicted a rare defeat on Temujin, boiling 70 captured chiefs alive in cauldrons. But Jamuka's cruelty drove more followers to Temujin's banner. The man who rewarded loyalty proved more attractive than the one who ruled through terror alone. When Temujin finally conquered the Tatars, the tribe that had murdered his father, his vengeance was systematic and terrible. He ordered the execution of every Tatar male taller than the height of a cart axle. It was genocide, the complete destruction of a people as a political entity. The surviving women and children were absorbed into Mongol society. The Tatars ceased to exist. Even his old ally Togrul Khan eventually turned against him, urged on by jealous advisors and his own ambitious son. The Karat War was particularly painful. Temujin had called Togrul father. But when forced to choose between sentiment and survival, Temujin chose survival. The Karats were crushed, their people absorbed, their identity erased. The Naimans were the last great power on the steppe. Their Khan had united the remaining tribes in a final desperate alliance against Temujin. The battle was fought in the shadow of the Altai Mountains in 1204. Temujin deployed a tactic that would become his signature, feigning retreat to draw the enemy into a trap, then encircling them with his superior cavalry. Jemuka was among those captured. The former blood brother was brought before Temujin in chains. What passed between them, these two men who had once sworn eternal friendship, can only be imagined. Jemuka reportedly asked for a noble death, without the spilling of blood, a request Temujin granted. His back was broken, a death befitting a royal prince. In 1206, after more than 20 years of warfare, every tribe on the Mongolian steppe had been conquered or had submitted voluntarily. The assembled chiefs gathered for the greatest Kurultai in history. Thousands of warriors spread across the grassland, their standards flying in the eternal wind. There, beside the source of the Onan River, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The title was unprecedented in its ambition. Not king of a tribe or lord of a region, but ruler of everything under the eternal blue sky. A white standard with 9 tails was raised, representing the 9 original tribes of the Mongol nation. The Mongol Empire had been born. Genghis Khan was now in his 40s, an old man by the standards of the steppe. His face bore the weathering of decades of harsh living. His eyes, which some chroniclers claimed were an unusual green or gray color, held the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime of struggle. He had united a people who had never been united before. Now he would do something even more remarkable. He would turn them into conquerors of the world. He issued the Great Yasa, a code of laws that would govern the Mongol Empire. Religious tolerance was mandated. Theft and adultery were punishable by death. Loyalty was the supreme virtue, betrayal the ultimate sin. Diplomats and messengers were sacred and inviolable. The rules were simple but absolute, and they would be enforced across the largest contiguous empire in human history. To understand how the Mongols conquered the world, you must first understand the Mongol warrior. Every male Mongol was a soldier from birth. There was no distinction between civilian and military. The entire society was organized for war. Each man brought his own horses, his own weapons, his own supplies. The army moved like a nomadic nation because that is exactly what it was. The Mongol composite bow was the deadliest weapon of its age. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, it could shoot arrows over 500 meters with accuracy. A skilled Mongol archer could loose arrows while galloping at full speed, shooting backward over his shoulder in the famous Parthian shot. Most Mongols could hit a moving target at 100 meters without breaking stride. Each warrior carried 2 bows, 2 quivers of arrows, a lasso, a sharpening file, a small tent, and rations of dried meat and curd. They wore armor of hardened leather, lighter than the metal worn by European or Chinese knights, but effective against slashing weapons. They could survive for weeks on nothing but their horses, drinking blood drawn from a small cut in the animal's neck mixed with milk. The Mongol horse was not impressive to look at. Small, shaggy, it resembled a pony more than a warhorse. But these animals were incredibly hardy, able to travel vast distances on minimal forage. Each warrior brought 5 or more horses, switching mounts constantly to keep them fresh. A Mongol army could cover 100 miles in a single day, a pace that seemed impossible to their enemies. The army organized into units called arbans of 10 men, zuns of 100, minghans of 1,000, and tumans of 10,000. Commanders were appointed by merit. A skilled herder could rise to lead 10,000 warriors if he proved his ability. This meritocratic system produced a class of generals whose tactical brilliance still impresses military historians. Mongol armies used an elaborate system of signals, including flags, torches, and whistling arrows, to coordinate movements across vast distances. Messengers on fast horses created a communication network that let commanders adjust strategy in real time. They practiced large-scale maneuvers constantly, treating their annual hunts as military exercises where tens of thousands of men learned to work as a single unit. Before any campaign, Mongol intelligence gathered information about enemy terrain, fortifications, political divisions, and potential traitors. Merchants, diplomats, and defectors were all sources. By the time a Mongol army appeared at a kingdom's borders, its commanders often knew more about the target than its own rulers did. They understood which generals were competent, which cities could resist siege, and which noble factions could be turned against each other. The Mongols had no tradition of siege warfare. Nomads had never needed to take walled cities. But Genghis Khan understood that to conquer settled civilizations, he would need to master this art. He conscripted engineers from every conquered people, Chinese experts in gunpowder, Persian masters of catapults, and created a corps of specialists who could reduce any fortification. Their siege techniques were devastatingly effective. They diverted rivers to flood cities or cut off water supplies. They used captives as human shields, driving them before the assault force. They catapulted diseased corpses over walls in an early form of biological warfare. Cities that resisted were shown no mercy. Those that surrendered immediately were often spared, creating a powerful incentive to capitulate. Terror was a deliberate weapon. When the Mongols took a city that had resisted, they systematically slaughtered the population, sparing only craftsmen and engineers who could be useful. Survivors were sent to spread word of what they had witnessed. The reputation preceded the army. Many cities surrendered without a fight rather than face annihilation. The feigned retreat was perhaps their most effective battlefield tactic. Mongol cavalry would engage the enemy, then turn and flee in apparent panic. Eager pursuers would break formation to chase, stretching out their lines over miles. Then the Mongols would wheel around, while hidden forces emerged from concealment on the flanks. The encirclement was complete. What had seemed like victory became a massacre. In open battle, the Mongols used a combination of light and heavy cavalry that no enemy could match. Light cavalry archers would harry the enemy formations, shooting thousands of arrows to weaken them while staying out of reach. When the enemy was sufficiently demoralized and disordered, heavy cavalry would charge home, breaking the shattered remnants with lance and sword. The Mongols also mastered the art of psychological disruption. They would light extra campfires to make their army seem larger. They would attack at night when enemies expected armies to rest. They would send prisoners ahead wearing Mongol uniforms to confuse intelligence gathering. Every advantage, no matter how small, was exploited. Among the commanders who served Genghis Khan, one stands above all others. Subutai, who began as the son of a blacksmith, rose to become the greatest general of the Mongol era, perhaps of any era. He commanded armies in more than 60 pitched battles and never lost one. He conquered more territory than any other commander in history. His campaigns covered more ground than those of Alexander, Hannibal, and Julius Caesar combined. Jebe, whose name meant the arrow, was another legendary figure. He had once shot Genghis Khan's horse from under him in battle. When captured, he openly confessed to the deed. Rather than execute him for this near assassination, Genghis Khan recognized his skill and courage and made him a commander. It was a perfect example of how merit trumped all other considerations in the Mongol system. Mongol generals were given extraordinary independence. Once overall strategy was determined, individual commanders were free to adapt tactics to local conditions. This decentralized command structure allowed Mongol armies to operate effectively across vast distances simultaneously. While European armies required constant orders from a central authority, Mongol forces could improvise and coordinate without direct oversight. The logistics of Mongol warfare were revolutionary. They carried minimal supplies, living off the land and their herds. This allowed them to move faster than any other army of the era. They could appear where they were least expected, strike, and vanish before a response could be organized. Enemies who prepared for conventional campaigns found themselves facing something entirely unprecedented. The training of Mongol soldiers began in infancy. Children learned to ride before they could walk properly. Archery practice was constant. Young men participated in hunts that served as military exercises, learning to coordinate with hundreds or thousands of others across miles of terrain. By the time they were adults, Mongol warriors had more real experience than most professional soldiers gained in a lifetime. Surprisingly, the Mongol army included soldiers of every religion and ethnicity. Genghis Khan's policy of religious tolerance meant that Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and followers of traditional shamanism all served side by side. Commanders were chosen for ability, not belief. This inclusive approach allowed the Mongols to incorporate conquered peoples quickly, turning former enemies into loyal soldiers within a generation. With this extraordinary military machine, Genghis Khan now turned his attention beyond the steppe. The settled kingdoms of China and Central Asia had wealth beyond imagining. Gold, silver, silk, slaves. The Mongol storm was about to break upon an unsuspecting world. And nothing would ever be the same again. The Great Wall of China stretched for thousands of miles, the greatest fortification ever built by human hands. For centuries, it had kept the northern barbarians at bay. Chinese emperors had spent fortunes maintaining it, garrisoning it, believing it would protect their civilization forever. In 1211, Genghis Khan proved them catastrophically wrong. Northern China was divided between two powers. The Western Xia Kingdom, ruled by the Tangut people, occupied the northwest. The Jin dynasty, controlled by the Jurchen, a semi-nomadic people who had conquered the region a century earlier, held the northeast. Both were wealthy, populous, and militarily formidable. The Jin alone could field armies of hundreds of thousands. Genghis Khan first tested his war machine against the Western Xia. He demanded tribute and submission. The Tangut emperor reportedly replied that if the Mongols were so powerful, they should find soldiers elsewhere. It was a defiance that would cost his kingdom everything. The campaign against Western Xia demonstrated the Mongols' terrifying adaptability. When traditional siege methods failed, they attempted to divert a river to flood the capital city. The dam broke the wrong way, flooding the Mongol camp instead. But the Tanguts were so terrified by the attempt that they surrendered anyway. Genghis Khan accepted their submission and turned his attention to the greater prize. In 1211, the Mongol invasion of the Jin dynasty began. The force Genghis Khan assembled was enormous by Mongol standards, perhaps 100,000 warriors. It was still vastly outnumbered by the Jin armies. The Chinese had over 1 million soldiers under arms, and some of the greatest fortresses ever built. On paper, the invasion was suicidal. The Jin military was formidable. They had learned steppe warfare from their own nomadic ancestors, and employed many Mongol and Turkic cavalry units. Their infantry was disciplined and well-equipped. Their fortifications had been refined over centuries. A direct assault on their position should have been impossible. But the Mongols did not fight directly. At the Battle of Yehuling, the Mongols feigned retreat, drawing the Jin cavalry into pursuing. Then they wheeled and encircled them. The slaughter was horrific. Bodies piled so high that the area was known as the Field of Dead for generations. In a single battle, the Jin lost the flower of their military. The Great Wall was supposed to stop exactly this kind of invasion, but Genghis Khan found a way through. Defectors showed him unguarded passes. Mongol scouts discovered where garrisons were weak. The wall that had seemed impregnable proved to have many gaps. The Mongols poured through like water through a broken dam. The Mongols surrounded Zhongdu, the Jin capital, modern-day Beijing. It was one of the largest and most heavily fortified cities in the world. Its walls seemed to mock the nomads who had no tradition of siege warfare. Genghis Khan lacked the forces to take it by storm. So he simply waited, devastating the countryside and cutting off all supplies. The siege lasted months. Inside the walls, food ran out. People ate leather, then rats, then corpses. The Jin emperor fled south, abandoning his capital. It was a fatal mistake. When his own generals saw that he had given up, they began to surrender. The empire was crumbling from within. Zhongdu fell in 1215. The sacking lasted a month. Mongol soldiers wandered through palaces that held treasures accumulated over centuries. Gold, jade, silk, porcelain. The wealth was almost incomprehensible to warriors who had grown up in felt tents. They burned what they could not carry. The smoke rose so high it could be seen for hundreds of miles. The Jin dynasty did not fall completely. The emperor retreated south, establishing a new capital at Kaifeng. But northern China was now Mongol territory. Genghis Khan had seized one of the richest regions on earth. The tribute extracted was staggering. 20,000 horses, hundreds of thousands of bolts of silk, countless cartloads of gold and silver. Among the captives taken at Zhongdu was a man named Yelu Chukai, a Khitan nobleman who had served the Jin administration. Genghis Khan recognized his value immediately. Yelu Chukai became one of the Khan's most trusted advisors. He would help transform the Mongol realm from a purely destructive force into an actual governing empire. Yelu Chukai convinced Genghis Khan that conquered peoples were worth more alive than dead. Taxing farmers produced more wealth over time than simply looting them once. Preserving cities and their craftsmen created resources that endless destruction never could. It was a lesson the Mongols would apply imperfectly but increasingly effectively as their empire grew. The conquest of northern China also provided the Mongols with new military capabilities. Chinese engineers understood siege warfare, gunpowder, and fortress construction. Chinese administrators knew how to govern large settled populations. These skills would prove essential in the campaigns to come. The Mongol army was becoming something new, a fusion of steppe mobility and settled sophistication. Genghis Khan appointed governors to administer the conquered territories. The system was simple but effective. Local rulers who submitted were often left in place, required only to pay tribute and provide troops when summoned. Those who resisted were replaced with Mongol appointees. The goal was revenue and military support, not cultural transformation. But while Genghis Khan's attention was focused on the Jin, the Western Xia rebelled. They refused to provide troops for the campaigns in the West, claiming they were exhausted from previous demands. It was a betrayal that Genghis Khan would neither forgive nor forget. He swore to destroy them utterly, and eventually he would, though he would not live to see it completed. By 1217, Genghis Khan controlled most of northern China. The Jin still held out in the south, but they were broken as a major power. The Mongols had proven that their military techniques worked against the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. But even as they consolidated these conquests, events far to the west were drawing Genghis Khan toward his greatest campaign. The Silk Road, that ancient network of trade routes connecting east and west, had long been disrupted by political chaos. Genghis Khan saw an opportunity. Secure trade routes would bring wealth and intelligence. He sent an embassy to the Khwarezmian Empire, the dominant power in Central Asia, proposing commercial relations. It was a diplomatic overture that would end an apocalyptic war. The Khwarezmian Empire was one of the great powers of the Islamic world. Stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush, it controlled the wealthy cities of Central Asia. Samarkand, Bokhara, Urgench. These were centers of learning, commerce, and Islamic culture. Their Shah commanded enormous armies and ruled over millions of subjects. In 1218, a Mongol trade caravan arrived at the border city of Otrar. The local governor, suspecting the merchants were spies, seized their goods and executed them. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to demand justice, Shah Muhammad ordered them killed or mutilated. It was an insult that could only be answered with blood. The execution of ambassadors violated every code Genghis Khan held sacred. Messengers were inviolable. Their murder was unforgivable. The Khan reportedly climbed a mountain alone to pray and fast for 3 days. When he descended, he had made his decision. The Khwarezmian Empire would be destroyed. Its cities would burn. Its people would learn the cost of such treachery. The army that assembled for the Khwarezmian campaign was the largest Genghis Khan had ever commanded. Estimates vary wildly, but perhaps 200,000 warriors gathered for the march west. They brought Chinese siege engineers, Muslim craftsmen, and specialists from every conquered people. This was not a raid. It was an invasion meant to erase a civilization. The journey to Khwarezmia covered thousands of miles of some of the harshest terrain on Earth. Mountains, deserts, frozen passes. The Mongols crossed it all with their characteristic speed. Shah Muhammad had expected to have months or years to prepare. The Mongols arrived before his defenses were ready. The nightmare was about to begin. Shah Muhammad made a fatal strategic error. Rather than concentrate his forces for a decisive battle, he dispersed them across his empire's many fortified cities. He believed the Mongols could never take such powerful fortifications. Each city, he thought, would bleed the invaders until they gave up. He was catastrophically wrong. Genghis Khan divided his forces into 4 armies, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The Mongol command structure allowed these independent forces to coordinate across hundreds of miles. While the Shah struggled to understand where the main attack was coming from, the Mongols were everywhere at once. The first target was Otrar, where the merchants had been murdered. The city held out for 5 months, its garrison fighting with the desperation of men who knew what awaited them. When it finally fell, the governor who had ordered the original massacre was captured. Silver was melted and poured into his eyes and ears. His city was razed until no 2 stones stood together. Bokhara, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, fell next. Genghis Khan reportedly rode his horse into the main mosque, declaring that he was the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. The city's libraries were burned. Its scholars were killed. Centuries of accumulated knowledge vanished in flames. Samarkand was the jewel of Central Asia, a city of 400,000 people, protected by walls said to be unbreakable. It surrendered after only 5 days when the garrison attempted a sortie and was annihilated. The population was driven out of the city and divided. Craftsmen were spared for slavery. Everyone else was distributed among the Mongol soldiers to be killed. The scale of the killing was almost incomprehensible. Cities that resisted were completely depopulated. The Mongols reportedly killed over 1 million people in Samarkand alone, though such figures are impossible to verify. What is certain is that regions that had been densely populated for millennia were reduced to empty wilderness. Some have never fully recovered. Shah Muhammad fled his collapsing empire, pursued by Mongol forces under Jebe and Subutai. The 2 greatest generals of the age had been given a simple order: find the Shah. Do not stop until he is dead. With 20,000 men, they embarked on perhaps the most extraordinary cavalry pursuit in military history. The chase covered thousands of miles. Jebe and Subutai rode through the heart of Khwarezmian, defeating armies, taking cities, always just behind their quarry. They crossed mountains that should have been impassable. They traversed deserts without water for days. The Shah fled from city to city, each one falling to the Mongols shortly after he left. Shah Muhammad, once ruler of one of the mightiest empires on earth, died of pleurisy on a small island in the Caspian Sea, stripped of everything, wearing borrowed clothes. His empire had been destroyed in less than 2 years. His dynasty was finished. The Mongols had achieved a victory so complete that it stunned the entire world. The destruction continued. At Urgench, the capital of the empire, the Mongols faced their bloodiest urban battle. The city fought street by street, building by building. The Mongols eventually diverted the river to flood the city. When resistance finally ended, they massacred the entire population and demolished the buildings so thoroughly that the site was abandoned for decades. Shah Muhammad's son Jalal ad-Din proved more capable than his father. He rallied the remnants of the Khwarezmian army and actually defeated a Mongol force at Parwan, one of the rare Mongol battlefield losses. But he could not reverse the tide. Genghis Khan himself marched against him with overwhelming force. At the Indus River, Jalal ad-Din made his final stand. Cornered against the water, his army was destroyed. The prince himself rode his horse off a cliff into the river and escaped, swimming across under a hail of arrows. Genghis Khan reportedly held his sons back from pursuing, admiring the man's courage and wishing his own sons had such spirit. The destruction of Khwarezmian devastated a region that had been among the most prosperous in the world. Irrigation systems that had been maintained for thousands of years were destroyed. Cities that had been centers of culture for centuries were emptied. The population collapse was catastrophic. Some historians estimate that the region did not recover its pre-Mongol population until the 20th century. Persian poets lamented the destruction in verses that still resonate. They wrote of cities where owls nested in palaces that had housed kings, of gardens turned to desert, of libraries where scholars had once debated reduced to scattered bones. The Mongol invasion became, in Islamic memory, a trauma comparable to any in history. But Jebe and Subutai were not finished. Having destroyed the Shah, they asked permission to continue westward on a reconnaissance in force. Genghis Khan agreed. With perhaps 20,000 men, these two generals embarked on one of the most remarkable expeditions in military history, a journey that would take them around the Caspian Sea and into the heart of the Western world. The Mongols swept through the Caucasus, defeating the Kingdom of Georgia, one of the most powerful Christian states in the region. The Georgian army, which had never lost a major battle, was annihilated in a single afternoon. The Mongols did not occupy the territory. They simply destroyed its military power and moved on. They continued north, crossing the Caucasus Mountains through passes that should have been impossible in winter. They emerged onto the steppes of southern Russia, a land inhabited by Turkic tribes and dominated by the Kievan Rus, the ancestors of modern Russians and Ukrainians. This was a world that knew nothing of the Mongols, and the Mongols knew little of it. The Cumans, a Turkic people who dominated the western steppe, sent desperate appeals to the Russian princes. The Mongols first demanded that the Russians surrender the Cumans. When the Russians refused, executing the Mongol ambassadors in a tragic repetition of the Khwarezmian mistake, war became inevitable. At the Khalkha River in 1223, Jebe and Subutai faced a combined Russian-Cuman army that vastly outnumbered them. Using their signature tactics, feigning retreat for 9 days to draw the enemy out and separate them from their supplies, the Mongols turned and struck. The result was annihilation. The Russian princes who were captured were laid on the ground, while the Mongol generals placed a wooden platform over them and held a victory feast. The princes were slowly crushed to death under the weight of the celebrating warriors. It was a death without blood spilling, technically honorable by Mongol standards, but horrifying to the defeated. Having completed what may be the greatest reconnaissance in military history, covering over 8,000 miles in 3 years, defeating every army they encountered, Jebe and Subutai turned east to rejoin Genghis Khan. Jebe died during the return journey, but Subutai would live to command even greater campaigns. The information they brought back would guide future Mongol conquests. From 1219 to 1223, the Mongols had destroyed one of the great empires of the world, devastated Central Asia, crushed the Kingdom of Georgia, and shattered the military power of the Russian princes. It was a campaign of conquest unprecedented in scale and speed, and it was just the beginning. Genghis Khan returned east from the Khwarezmian campaign in 1223. He was now over 60 years old, ancient by the standards of his time and place. His body bore the scars of decades of warfare. But there was unfinished business that demanded his attention. The Western Xia had defied him, and such betrayal could not be allowed to stand. In 1226, despite his advancing age and failing health, Genghis Khan assembled his forces for one last campaign. The Western Xia would be punished for their refusal to provide troops for the Khwarezmian War. It would be a war of extermination, meant to erase the Tangut people from history as completely as the Tatars had been erased generations before. The campaign was characteristically devastating. City after city fell. The Tangut armies were destroyed in the field. The population was slaughtered with methodical thoroughness. This was not conquest for tribute or territory. This was punishment, and the punishment was genocide. The Tangut people would never recover. In 1227, during the final stages of the campaign, Genghis Khan fell ill. The exact cause remains uncertain. Some accounts say he fell from his horse while hunting. Others suggest illness or infection. Whatever the cause, the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen was dying. On his deathbed, Genghis Khan gave final instructions to his sons and generals. The Western Xia must be destroyed completely. The Jin dynasty, still holding out in southern China, must eventually be conquered. His empire must remain united under his chosen successor. The alternative was civil war, the fragmentation of everything he had built. Genghis Khan died in August 1227, at approximately 65 years of age. His death was kept secret while his orders regarding the Western Xia were carried out. The Tangut capital surrendered, and the population was massacred. By the time the news became public, an entire people had paid the price for defying the Khan. He was buried in secret, somewhere in the mountains of Mongolia. According to legend, everyone who participated in the burial was killed to keep the location hidden. An entire river may have been diverted to cover the site. To this day, despite numerous attempts, no one has found his tomb. His final resting place remains one of history's great mysteries. Before his death, Genghis Khan had divided his empire among his 4 sons by Borte. Joki, despite the questions about his parentage, received the western territories including Russia. Subutai received Central Asia. Talyui, the youngest, received the Mongol homeland according to tradition. Ogedei, the 3rd son, was designated as the overall ruler, the Great Khan. Ogedei was perhaps the most balanced of the brothers. He lacked Joki's brooding intensity, Sugutai's rigid conservatism, and Talyui's martial ferocity. But he had diplomatic skills, administrative ability, and enough military competence to maintain respect. Most importantly, his father had chosen him, and in the Mongol system that choice was law. In 1229, a great Kurultai confirmed Ogedei as the 2nd Great Khan. The transition was remarkably smooth, a testament to both the strength of the system Genghis Khan had created and the respect his sons had for their father's wishes. The empire remained united, poised for further expansion. Ogedei established a permanent capital at Karakoram, a city that would become the center of the Mongol world. For a nomadic people with no tradition of urban life, it was a radical innovation. Foreign visitors described a cosmopolitan metropolis where Chinese craftsmen, Persian merchants, European missionaries, and steppe warriors all mingled. Ogedei's first major campaign completed the destruction of the Jin dynasty that his father had begun. In 1234, after a brutal siege, the Jin capital of Kaifeng fell. The last Jin emperor committed suicide. Northern China was now fully under Mongol control. Genghis Khan's revenge for the centuries of Chinese exploitation of the steppe nomads was complete. With the Jin conquered, Ogedei turned his attention westward. Reports from Jebe and Subutai's reconnaissance had revealed that Europe was divided, wealthy, and militarily inferior to what the Mongols had already defeated. In 1235, the Great Khan ordered the conquest of Europe. Subutai would lead the campaign. The invasion force included princes from all branches of the royal family. Batu, son of the deceased Joki, commanded the expedition nominally. But the real strategic genius was Subutai, now in his 60s but still unmatched as a military mind. Together they would lead what Europeans would call the Mongol invasion, a campaign that came within a hair's breadth of conquering the entire continent. In 1237, the Mongol forces swept into Russia. The principalities that had barely recovered from the earlier raid were now facing full-scale invasion. Ryazan fell first, its entire population massacred, a warning of what awaited those who resisted. City after city fell. Vladimir, Moscow, Novgorod was spared only because the spring thaw made the terrain impassable. In 1240, Kiev, the ancient capital of Kievan Rus and one of the great cities of the medieval world, was captured and destroyed. The population was slaughtered so completely that travelers 6 years later reported seeing countless skulls and bones scattered across the ruins. Russia would remain under Mongol domination, in what became known as the Mongol Yoke, for over 200 years. The Golden Horde, as Bata's realm came to be called, would shape Russian development profoundly. Some historians argue that Russian autocracy and isolation from Western Europe can be traced directly to this period of subjugation. With Russia subdued, the Mongols continued west. Poland, Hungary, the heart of European civilization lay ahead, seemingly defenseless against the unstoppable horde. The greatest military crisis in European history since the fall of Rome had begun. Europe in 1240 was a fragmented continent of feudal kingdoms, warring duchies, and independent city-states. The Holy Roman Empire was locked in endless conflict with the papacy. France and England eyed each other suspiciously. No unified command existed that could coordinate resistance to an external threat. It was an ideal target. In April 1241, one wing of the Mongol army, commanded by Baidar and Khadan, met a combined force of Polish and German knights at Legnica in modern Poland. The European heavy cavalry charged with their characteristic courage, seeking to close with the enemy and fight hand to hand. The Mongols used their feigned retreat, drawing the knights away from their infantry, then encircled them. The slaughter was complete. Henry the Pious, Duke of Silesia, was killed. 9 sacks of ears were collected from the fallen Europeans, one for each of the initial Mongol clans. The flower of Polish and German chivalry was destroyed in a single afternoon. When Henry's body was found, it had been stripped and mutilated beyond recognition. 2 days later, 1,500 miles to the south, the main Mongol force under Batu and Subutai faced the Hungarian army at Mohi. King Bela IV of Hungary had assembled the largest army in the region, perhaps 60,000 men. They were confident. The Mongols were just barbarians. How could they defeat the finest knights in Christendom? Subutai demonstrated why he was considered the greatest general of his age. He sent a diversionary force to attack across a heavily defended bridge, drawing Hungarian attention. Meanwhile, his main force crossed the river at an unguarded ford downstream. By dawn, the Hungarians were surrounded. The trap was perfect. The Hungarians attempted to break out but found the Mongols had left one gap in their encirclement, a deliberate opening. As the desperate soldiers fled through this gap, Mongol cavalry pursued and slaughtered them for miles. Perhaps 70,000 Hungarians died at Mohi. The kingdom was left virtually defenseless. For a year, the Mongols occupied Hungary, systematically devastating the country. They burned villages, slaughtered populations, and enslaved whoever might be useful. Hungary lost perhaps half its population. The kingdom would take centuries to recover. Similar devastation was inflicted on Poland, Croatia, and the surrounding regions. Panic spread across Europe. Emperor Frederick II tried to organize resistance but was too busy fighting the Pope to commit fully. The Pope himself called for a crusade against the Mongols, but no one answered. European rulers fortified their capitals and prayed. Vienna seemed to be next. France and Germany after that. Nothing could stop the horde. Mongol patrols reached the outskirts of Vienna. Scouts observed Venice. The conquest of Western Europe seemed imminent. Military historians have debated for centuries whether Europe could have resisted. Most conclude that it could not. The Mongol military machine was simply superior to anything Europe could field. Then, in December 1241, messengers brought news from the east. Genghis Khan was dead, killed by years of heavy drinking. According to Mongol law, all princes of the blood must return for the Kurultai that would choose his successor. The invasion of Europe ground to a halt. In early 1242, the Mongol forces withdrew from Hungary, much to the disbelief of the European survivors. They had won every battle. Nothing stood between them and the Atlantic. But the throne in Karakorum mattered more than any Western conquest. The princes returned east to compete for the succession. Europeans attributed their salvation to divine intervention. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered across the continent. The terror of the Mongol invasion passed into legend, a trauma that would shape European consciousness for generations. The fear of invasion from the east became embedded in Western culture. Batu Khan never returned to campaign in Western Europe. Instead, he consolidated his control over Russia and the Western Steppe, establishing his capital at Sarai on the Volga River. The Golden Horde became one of the most powerful states in the medieval world, dominating Russian politics for over 2 centuries. The Mongol invasion transformed European military thinking. Fortifications were redesigned. Cavalry tactics were reconsidered. The assumption of European military superiority, so fundamental to the crusading mindset, had been shattered. The Mongols had proven that the West was not invincible. It was a lesson that would take centuries to fully process. The Mongol conquests had devastated much of Asia, but in their wake came an unexpected consequence. Peace. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, created the largest free trade zone the world had ever seen. For the first time in history, a merchant could travel from Korea to the Mediterranean under the protection of a single authority. Trade flourished as never before. Chinese silk and porcelain flowed west. Persian carpets and Indian spices traveled east. Ideas, technologies, and diseases moved along the same routes. The Mongols actively promoted commerce, understanding that prosperous subjects produce more tax revenue than impoverished ones. Foreign visitors marveled at the cosmopolitan nature of the Mongol court. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who served Kublai Khan for 17 years, described wonders that his contemporaries could barely believe. Paper money, coal, a postal system that spanned continents. The Mongol realm had become a bridge between civilizations. The Mongol period accelerated the transfer of transformative technologies. Gunpowder, invented in China, spread westward. Printing techniques diffused along the trade routes. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge moved in both directions. The world was becoming more connected than it had ever been before. The Mongol Empire continued to expand. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis and son of Talyui, completed the conquest of China, overthrowing the Southern Song dynasty and establishing the Yuan dynasty in 1271. For the first time in centuries, all of China was united under a single rule, even if that rule was foreign. Not all Mongol campaigns succeeded. Kublai Khan twice attempted to invade Japan, and twice his fleets were destroyed by typhoons that the Japanese called kamikaze, divine wind. The attempted conquests of Vietnam and Java also failed. The Mongol military machine, optimized for land warfare on the steppes, struggled with naval operations and tropical conditions. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire was fragmenting. The four khanates established by Genghis Khan's sons were increasingly going their own way. The Yuan dynasty in China, the Subutai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Golden Horde in Russia maintained nominal loyalty to each other, but operated as independent states. The Western Mongols increasingly adopted the cultures of their subjects. The Ilkhans of Persia converted to Islam. The Golden Horde followed. The Subutai Khanate fragmented between settled Muslim rulers and traditional steppe nomads. Only in Mongolia proper and China did the Mongols maintain their distinct identity. In China, resentment of foreign rule eventually boiled over. In 1368, a Chinese rebel named Zhu Yuanzhang captured Beijing and established the Ming dynasty. The Mongols were driven back to the steppe, ending a century of rule over the world's most populous nation. The Yuan had lasted less than 100 years. The Mongol legacy lived on in unexpected ways. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, claimed descent from Genghis Khan and built a new empire in Central Asia during the 14th century. His conquests were almost as devastating as the original Mongol invasions, but his empire, unlike Genghis Khan's, did not long survive his death. The Mongol conquests left a permanent mark on humanity. Genetic studies suggest that 1 in 200 people alive today may be descended from Genghis Khan himself or his close male relatives. The borders drawn by Mongol conquest shaped the political geography of Asia for centuries. Trade routes they established still influence economic patterns today. Today, Mongolia remains a small nation between Russia and China, still home to nomadic herders who live much as their ancestors did 8 centuries ago. The empire they built is long gone, but the memory persists. In the vast grasslands under the eternal blue sky, the spirit of Genghis Khan